Good morning, everybody. It is Friday, May 9th. Welcome back to the channel for another live stream here on the RAS Picks YouTube channel. In today's episode, I'm going to be looking at the impact of hiring an offensive coach for the first time that calls plays. Does it matter? Does it make teams better? And trying to put some numbers and context behind a very popular narrative that is going to be shared a ton in previews. We see it every year. Everybody talks about the offensive coach. How much does it matter? What is the impact? And more importantly, in terms of betting, does it matter right away when the season begins? We're going to look at the first 4 games, go back 10 NFL seasons, look at all the data, compare it, try to get some takeaways, and then speculate what this means for the Cowboys, Bears, Jaguars, and Saints, all 4 of them, as we look forward to 4 new offensive-minded head coaches that will retain play-calling duties for the season up ahead. Before we get into the show, just want to remind everybody, raspicks.com/NFL. All of the details for the NFL service are now live and up on the website. You can see early bird pricing, with the first release coming as early as next Thursday, possibly 6 days from now. We'll see the first release go out on the service. So if you're interested in joining, you can see all of the details over at raspicks.com/NFL. Time is running out. If you are, in fact, interested, would recommend anybody who wants to be part of the service this season, head over to the website, see all of the details, and get ready before next Thursday. The following article was posted this morning on footballbetters.com. It is a free email newsletter that you can follow. This is where I post all of the offseason content. I'm going to be doing a lot of these question and answers along with popular preseason narratives that we hear a lot in previews, figuring out what matters, what doesn't matter, what should we look at more, what should we look at less, and quite frankly, I see this mentioned a ton, and I do a lot of mentioning of it myself because we just hear when a team hires an offensive coach, especially if it's a younger offensive coach, it's a really good hire. We very seldom question the hire of great offensive coordinators promoted to head coach, but it does seem like subjectively there's a pretty big variance between the good and the bad. And so this morning on footballbetters.com, which is free to follow, I looked at all the details and went back through it to start off the popular narrative series. Hopefully we'll have a handful of these in the next couple of weeks just to answer the big questions and topics that you're going to hear a ton about in the offseason leading up to kickoff. So first and foremost, the big question is there immediate improvement? And I looked at the first 4 games specifically, and the answer is that yes, there is immediate improvement. There have been 21 coaches hired in the last 10 NFL seasons who were previously an offensive coordinator and in one case a quarterback coach that were given a head coaching job and they chose to retain play calling duties. And this is looking at the first 4 games. And here's what I found out. Yards per play in the first 4 games with the new team compared to the numbers last year went up by 5.4%. Yards per drive for the first 4 weeks compared to the last season numbers for the team improved by 6.2%. And points per drive improved by 14.7%. Those numbers for a team that's running at an average tempo and running an average amount of plays per game is a gain of roughly 2.8 points per game in the first 4 games. So keep that in mind as we get to weeks 1 to 4. These coaches, on average, the last 10 years have delivered an increase of 2.8 points more per game compared to the last season numbers for their new teams. And to give you an idea of kind of what I was looking at when it came to the data and how it broke down, here is the list of all of the offensive coordinators that were given a head coaching job, their previous role, what the numbers looked like in the first 4 weeks, what the numbers looked like in the prior year. And then I highlighted in green the improvements, highlighted in red the failures and coaches that tended to make the team worse, whether it was scheme, whether it was quarterback. We'll talk about that in a second. Then I also looked at the DVOA of opponents on defense that they faced. The strength of schedule had a very big impact on how these teams performed. We have a number of great schemes that were unable to overcome difficult schedules, even with great quarterbacks, and the opposite, where some not so great schemes were able to have a very quick start against very weak schedules. So that's a key part, which we'll talk about in just a second. So yes, there is immediate improvement. It tends to happen right away for all of these coaches. And we see 5 to 6% improvement in yards per play and per drive and 14% in points per drive, about 2.8 points per game improvement for these coaches with their new team. Now, where this starts to get a little bit messy, and we can't just say, here's a blanket statement that covers everything, is major improvement tends to be about a 50-50 proposition. And what I say by major improvement is, so we look at the 21 coaches that were hired after being an offensive coordinator that were given play calling duties. There was a net overall improvement. But in terms of coaches who exceeded the average bump that these coaches give a new team, only 9 of the 21 coaches were able to do that. So 14 of 21, 66%, were able to show some level of improvement, but only 9 of 21, 43%, exceeded the average improvement driven by all of these coaches taking over the new teams. And 7 of the 21, 33%, failed to match the numbers from last year and actually provided a worse offense to the team. So it's about a 50-50 proposition that you're going to see that big leap that I think everybody hopes, and we tend to hear kind of talked about when it comes to offensive coaches. It's about a coin flip that your new offensive head coach, if you're a fan of one of these 4 teams, is going to be able to do so. When we start to look at some of the outliers and start to look at what was in common and what some of these coaches that did very well or poorly shared, when teams showed big improvement and coaches were very successful, there was one big thing that I took away from all of it, and it is that these coaches came from very well-respected coaching trees. Now, it sounds obvious. If a coach has a very strong background and comes from a great offensive scheme and knows it and can install it, he's bound to have success. But I think it's something that tends to be a little bit overlooked. And I know coaching trees are getting a little bit vague at this time, but it's hard not to notice the fact that of these 8 coaches that improved above the average and were significant outliers, they all came from the Andy Reid or Mike Shanahan coaching tree. Whether you want to tie that down to the Kyle Shanahan coaching tree as well, there were ties from all of these coaches that took a big leap to the Reid and Shanahan coaching tree. But that wasn't it. There was one other thing that really stood out when looking back at how these coaches performed. And it was not only coming from the Reid or Shanahan tree, but they replaced coaches in that new team that were one of 2 things. The first was a CEO style coach that maybe wasn't designated an offensive or defensive coach, delegated the play calling duties, and had become a little bit stale in what they do. We've seen coaches either really gravitate to one side of the ball or stay pretty neutral. And in all 8 of these instances, it was either replacing that CEO style coach or replacing a defensive-minded head coach. And so as I look at this and I think about it, the bump in these first 4 games makes a lot of sense when you have that strong coaching background and that new scheme coming in to replace something that either wasn't focused on offense or was kind of neutral and delegating things. It's that major shift that happens that tends to have such a positive result early, whether it's from teams not knowing what to prepare for, whether it's just numbers the prior year that were really poor. That's where it really stood out. And we saw all of these outlier great performers come from that and replace those style of coaches. Now, the one exception in all of this was Chip Kelly, who was an offensive-minded head coach. You think back to the Eagles, was replaced by Doug Peterson. But Chip Kelly had a very extreme offensive scheme, incredibly high tempo, very quick. And by the time he was done in Philly, that had become incredibly stale, had become incredibly worn out. And so I do think in a way he fits that category of that CEO style coach in a way that you can kind of look at that scheme and say, like, this was very effective in year 1. As it went on, completely died out and was in that stale comparative category to some of those CEO style head coaches that were replaced. Now, the 7 worst performers, they also had a common trait. And that was that 6 of the 7 faced a schedule that had at least 3 opponents that ranked top 12 in defensive DVOA. And what's interesting about this is, as I kind of got the data summarized and I look back, my thought was, okay, these failures are going to be coaches that were disasters and had really bad quarterback scenarios. And the odd thing was that wasn't true, because in these failures, names like Matt LaFleur and Kevin O'Connell and Zach Taylor and Arthur Smith, who's a little bit on the fringe, but those guys were working with quarterbacks like Aaron Rodgers, Kirk Cousins, Andy Dalton, Matt Ryan. A lot of these failures weren't bad coaches with bad quarterbacks. In fact, it was kind of the contrary, where it was good coaches now with good, established, stable, veteran quarterback situations. And they just were not able to overcome that difficult schedule early. And while they had success later on, early on in the season against those tough schedules, the better defenses won out. And so as you look forward to this season and you keep that in mind, you might have a really good coach and a really good scheme and a really good change with a really good quarterback. But early on in the season, it's proven to be very difficult to overcome those difficult schedules. Word of the day might be difficult in this category specifically, but that's something to keep in mind and circle. It's really tough. Now, Nathaniel Hackett was the one exception. I said 6 of 7, but Nathaniel Hackett was kind of the exception to everything. His tenure in Denver was viewed as one of the worst ever for an NFL coach. He actually had a very easy schedule and still failed, even with Russell Wilson, the veteran quarterback, coming in. So make of that what you will for Nathaniel Hackett, but a lot of common similarities between these coaches really struggling early against good defenses. Now, a big surprise to me was quarterback continuity didn't matter for these coaches as much as I thought it would. My biggest thought going into doing this research and looking back at some of these coaches was that quarterbacks and schedule are going to overpower everything. And you might have underwhelming coaches with a good quarterback or the other way around. That wasn't the case. 5 of the 7 failures actually had very stable quarterback scenarios with returning veteran quarterbacks. McAdoo failed miserably with Manning. Cutter failed miserably with Winston. Kitchens failed miserably with Mayfield. Taylor failed miserably with Dalton. And Smith failed miserably with Matt Ryan. So you think about those quarterbacks in that scenario, those were not disaster and bottom-feeding quarterback rooms and offenses that these guys walked into. It was just bad scheme, perhaps, or bad quarterback play, or quarterbacks at the end of the cycle with teams. A lot of different things went into it aside from just being bad quarterbacks. Really, the only bad QB scenario, in a way, that you could look at and say it was a first-year head coach taking over play-calling duties and a first-year quarterback stepping in was Shanahan and the failure with Hoyer. And he was benched after 6 or 7 games. And then Nathaniel Hackett is mentioned with Russell Wilson. That was a new quarterback and a new head coach in a first year working together that never worked out. But I think that one's firmly more on Hackett. And so quarterback continuity, offensive line continuity is a video for another week. Those are things that get tossed around a lot. And it didn't matter early in the season as much as I thought that it would. Now let's talk about the 4 biggest early season success stories. All of them had one thing in common, and that was just the more drastic the scheme change, the more impact that it had to the offense and the bigger the improvement that the offense had. So there were 4 that stood out of these teams that improved, that took the biggest leaps, and they were all huge changes and huge shifts. So the first was Sean McVay taking over for Jeff Fisher. If you think back to Jeff Fisher at the end of his tenure with the Rams, it was static, it was basic, it was field position and ball control focused, run heavy. It was bad. And Jared Goff's first year was completely butchered. Sean McVay was the hot offensive coordinator that year. He had just turned around the Washington Commanders and brought them into top 5 in many offensive categories. He comes into Los Angeles and switches all of that static, run-heavy, ball control, field position offense into outside zone, play action, concepts with a lot of pre-snap motion that we just haven't seen in the league very often before at that time. That drastic switch, which is one of the starkest in history, led the Rams to improving by 14.8 yards per drive and 1.9 points per drive. Both of those were the biggest improvements in the last 10 years in the first 4 weeks for a head coach in his first year calling plays, taking over a team. Massive shift for the Rams, and that's why McVay probably had a lot of success early. Now, another one, Frank Reich taking over for Chuck Pagano with the Colts. It was an improvement of 10.7 yards per drive, so about 4 less than the Rams, and 1.1 points per drive, nearly a point less. But it was, if you remember, Chuck Pagano, that was a lot of the Bruce Arians, no risk it, no biscuit, deep vertical shots. Andrew Luck was getting killed in the pocket. That was an offense that had become quite stale. When Frank Reich came in, it was replacing those vertical shots with very quick passes, very rhythm-based passes, a lot of max protect, a lot of RPOs, and it completely shifted that Colts offense, which in Reich's first season was number 1 for sack avoidance. It was also Andrew Luck's best career season ever. And so that was another, albeit not maybe as significant and night and day and drastic, going from that conservative style. It was changing an aggressive style that was a little bit worn down and not fitting the needs of the teams into something completely different, and had an immediate impact. Matt Nagy gets a lot of criticism for who he is, and especially what he was as a head coach with the Chicago Bears. However, his first year replacing John Fox was a massive change. And the word that is used most often looking back was gimmicky. And a lot of the trick plays and the misdirection kind of wore out in year 2. But in year 1, when the Bears went 12-4, Matt Nagy's offense was amazing. And it was a big improvement relative to what the Bears were the season prior. May not have been a top 10 dominant offense in the league, but that first year with Nagy was a big step forward for the Bears relative to what they were, which was bottom of the league, 32nd, 31st. They got into the average range, which is a huge leap year over year. But in the first 4 games, Matt Nagy improved the Bears by 9 yards per drive and 1.4 points per drive as well. Some of the biggest improvements that we've seen any head coach with play calling duties have in the first 4 weeks of a new tenure with the scheme. Again, we see that coaching tree tie. Matt Nagy, an Andy Reid disciple, replaces an outdated John Fox scheme. It was the second best Bears offense in the last 2 decades leading up to this year, which I think people have very high expectations for as well. And then the fourth big early season improvement was Mike McDaniel replacing Brian Flores. And this is what I'm talking about when you get this extreme contrast in scheme and thoughts and way teams are run. Brian Flores, think about what he was with Miami. Very strict head coach, entirely defensive focused, really no need or any time spent on the offense from him. There was no clear identity. There was no clear scheme. Dolphins offense really struggled. And then Mike McDaniel steps in, and I mean, it is a complete 180. Entirely offensive focus, ties to the Kyle Shanahan tree. It goes from scheme-less chaos to the most pre-snap motion-heavy offense in football. Extreme emphasis on rhythm, very quick passes, immediate improvement, 9.5 yards per drive better, 1.1 points per drive better. So again, you look back at this list, very extreme changes. That's really a positive looking back at this. Ties to strong coaching trees, taking something that was outdated or focused on the defense and doing things to make life easier for the quarterback. Those were all big positives in this. And so as I look forward to this season and in general, just trying to answer the question, do new head coaches who are first-time head coaches that have play calling duties improve teams immediately? The answer overall is yes, but the answer is more of a yes. The more drastic the scheme change, the more coaches are tied to strong coaching trees, and the bigger the gap between the offensive focus that they are bringing to the previous head coach being focused on defense, being a CEO style coach. You just are looking for extremes in this, and it tends to work well, and you see that. And then, of course, on top of that, it's out of control of the coaches and teams. But if a coach in this position can draw an easy schedule, it's a massive positive. There's only 2 of 10 instances that we've seen where a coach can overcome a very difficult schedule. So the schedule tends to have a very big impact as well. So as we look at the 2025 outlook, there's 4 new play calling hires that are head coaches and their first time as a head coach in the NFL. Let's try speculate what we're getting from these 4 and how they fit in to what we just talked about. We'll start with Ben Johnson and the Chicago Bears. Everything about this, and I hope that this is a point that becomes a common talking point in previews. I haven't heard it yet, and as I was doing this, it was actually kind of spooky how many parallels there are with this Bears team in 25 to the Rams team in 2017. And so everything about the Ben Johnson hire in Chicago, to me, reminds me of the 2017 Rams. But look at some of these parallels. So think back to the Rams in 2017, if you can. It was a team that was 32nd in yards per play. They had just drafted Jared Goff, number 1 overall. It was a Jeff Fisher offense going out that was tired, that was outdated, that needed to be switched. That was all going on in LA. Now, the Sean McVay hire at the time, he was the red-hot coordinator that just spent a couple years working with the Washington Commanders and bringing them from a well below average offense to a top 5 unit. He was at the peak for excitement. He was viewed as the great hire that was going to modernize the LA Rams coming in. It sounds a lot to me like that's exactly what's going on with Ben Johnson and the Chicago Bears. The Bears last year had Matt Eberflus, who was the defensive-minded head coach, had spent his entire career on the defensive side of the football, had 3 different play callers working with Caleb Williams, who was a number 1 draft pick, just like Jared Goff was. The Bears last year in yards per play finished 32nd, just like the Rams did back in 2016. Ben Johnson has been working with the Detroit Lions the last couple of years, taking that offense from below average to well above average and a top 5 unit in the league. All of these things are very, very similar. And Ben Johnson, of all of these hires in the offseason, he was the hot coordinator. He was the guy that everybody wanted. It's just the exact same scenario. Now, where this gets even more interesting is in the offseason and Sean McVay's first offseason with the Rams, in terms of how they built that team, signed multiple offensive linemen in free agency. And then in the draft, with the first pick, they drafted a tight end. With the second pick, they drafted a wide receiver. What did the Chicago Bears do? Drafted multiple offensive linemen, or signed multiple offensive linemen in free agency. With their first draft pick, they drafted a tight end. With their second draft pick, they drafted a wide receiver. Exact same blueprint. Exact same follow-up. Exact same changes in the offseason. Exact same effort made by the new hot coordinator to perhaps make life easier for his number 1 draft pick quarterback from a year ago who really struggled. We saw a massive leap for the Rams. They went from 32nd all the way to 6th in yards per play, had a great offense. Is the expectation the same for the Bears? Perhaps not, because the one big variable in this that makes things a little bit different is the schedule. We've talked about it a couple times this week. The Bears' schedule, one of the most difficult in the NFL, 31st for difficulty. It's brutal. Can the Bears get an easy away schedule draw? Perhaps. Maybe those games are front-loaded, gives Ben Johnson a chance to come in and have that big improvement against easy teams. It's going to be critical that they do. There's a chance that the schedule difficulty derails this a little bit. And the other critique that I might have here that's maybe a little bit different, Ben Johnson not coming from either the Reid or Shanahan tree. Not a lot of ties. It's kind of a weird coaching tree for Ben Johnson. But so many parallels here to the Rams in 2017, to the Bears in 25 with Ben Johnson. I think of all of these 4 hires, it's probably the clearest and most immediate path to success and the immediate path to improvement just because of who is there, the pieces that are there, and what Johnson is able to do in terms of adaptivity to the guys that he has on the field. So I think that's a big positive there and one to look forward. But so many parallels to that Rams team in 2017. Liam Cohen with the Jacksonville Jaguars. This hire to me reminds me a lot of the Zach Taylor hire in 2019 by the Cincinnati Bengals. And I say that because if not for working with Sean McVay, which Cohen did for 4 years and Taylor did for a couple, do either of these guys get head coaching roles immediately like this? I think the answer is more likely no than yes. I remember when Zach Taylor was hired, the question was kind of like who and why. And for me, when Liam Cohen was hired with the Jags, there were so many weird scenarios and how it happened last minute and the flip-flopping. Again, it was kind of like the surprise hire. And similar to Zach Taylor, there were very varying levels of results. Liam Cohen has been an offensive coordinator for 2 years in the NFL. His 1 year with Sean McVay, that was the worst the Rams offense had ever been under Sean McVay with the Rams. It ranked 32nd, believe it or not. But then last year with the Bucs, Liam Cohen and that offense ranked 4th in yards per play. So we've seen very good and we've seen very bad from Liam Cohen. But it really reminds me of the Taylor hire by the Bengals, where there were just so many ties to McVay that Taylor was given the benefit of the doubt. And it feels to me like that's a little bit what's happening with Cohen. And it feels a little bit not only with this head coach hire, but the OC hire coming back from Kentucky with the Buccaneers last year, where it kind of feels like Cohen, I don't want to say lucked into that, but just came into a very favorable scenario. Now, it also kind of shares similar parallels to me with Taylor, because I think about Taylor and what happened with the Bengals. You end up with Joe Burrow. You end up with Jamar Chase. You end up with T. Higgins. Taylor's kind of ridden that high for 5 years. Now Cohen comes into the Jags. He gets Trevor Lawrence. He gets Brian Thomas. And now he gets Travis Hunter. It's a pretty great offensive trio. It's not on the Bengals level, but it's a solid trio that could probably make Cohen look better than what his scheme and deliverables might bring to the team. And so I think about this and the Jags fit. A lot of it doesn't make a lot of sense because the scheme shift, although it might be drastic in terms of the thought process behind it and the play calling on the field, Cohen's replacing a well-respected, offensive-minded, Super Bowl winning head coach. So it's not like this is a massive shift in culture. I think if anything, the shift in culture maybe is the worry and how Cohen's handled himself so far. It seems like if there's any new culture being driven in Jacksonville, it's more so coming from James Gladstone as the GM, who also has those LA ties to McVay and Les Snead. It feels more like it's being driven by him than it is by Liam Cohen. And so there's a lot of this looking back in the past here that says Cohen doesn't really fit into a lot of this criteria we just talked about. But similar to Zach Taylor, he has a couple offensive pieces that probably make him look better than his overall scheme and play calling might be to a team. It might be disproportionate in that regard. Now, Kellen Moore with the Saints is the opposite in many respects. It's not only a massive culture shift from Dennis Allen or Darren Rizzi last year, which was the Saints at the end of a 2-decade tenure and regime and ideology. This now with Kellen Moore coming in is going away from the defensive-minded head coaching roles that has been in place since Sean Payton left a few seasons ago. It's now a shift in culture going away from that regime that has been part of the Saints offense and defense for 20 years. It's the first departure from that since the early 2000s. And so when we talked about the drastic shift being a big positive, this of the 4 examples is arguably the biggest, even more so than what Ben Johnson is bringing to Chicago to replace what has been there with Matt Eberflus for a couple of seasons. Kellen Moore brings a very clear identity. Everywhere he's gone, his offense is ranked among the highest in terms of tempo per play. He puts a massive priority on a no-huddle offense. Everything he tries to do is very QB friendly in terms of driving space downfield. If there's a knock on what he has kind of maybe become a little bit stagnant of in past stops, it's relying a little bit too much on vertical concepts where some of these other offensive coaches that take over try to go a little bit opposite and make things quicker. That would be the one knock here on Moore. But the scheme change and the identity and the culture shift is probably so drastic that it doesn't matter. Another thing that could work in favor of Moore driving immediate improvement to the Saints is there's a very easy schedule forecasted for New Orleans. And that comes with how poorly they finished last year. But this is very likely in the first 4 weeks, a very easy draw for the Saints, which we've seen maybe questionable head coaching hires with questionable quarterback scenarios have a lot of success against. And if I was to tie Kellen Moore to one other thing that's, I think, very true here and very relevant, when Shane Steichen took over the Colts with Anthony Richardson, they had success against a difficult schedule, believe it or not. Shane Steichen drove improvement for that Colts team that was 0.7 yards per play better, 5 yards per drive better, and improved it by half a point per drive. And it was done so against a difficult schedule. I mean, the Colts faced a Ravens team that finished second in defensive DVOA, a Jags team that finished fourth. And so he was able to have immediate results with a rookie quarterback in Anthony Richardson very quickly, very early, and do so against a very difficult schedule. And the ties I see with Kellen Moore to Shane Steichen in that same scenario, Shane Steichen was the offensive coordinator for Nick Sirianni with the Eagles, left, came over to Indy with the rookie, very drastic change, very drastic scheme shift, and had a lot of success very early. Kellen Moore last year, offensive coordinator for the Eagles under Nick Sirianni, comes over to the Saints, should deliver an even more so different scheme and culture shift and identity shift. And there's a lot of ties to perhaps how much success we saw the Colts have with Richardson and Steichen in those first 4 weeks. Now, there's no Reed, Shanahan tree ties here for Kellen Moore, but this to me really resembles, in a way, at a lesser level, I think back to Mike McDaniel replacing Brian Flores, defensive-minded head coach, very stale, no clear identity. McDaniel comes in with very aggressive pre-snap concepts, very QB-friendly play calling. Kind of looks like what Kellen Moore could potentially do here with Tyler Shuck as a quarterback in week 1. Is that performance going to be on that Dolphins level? Of course not. Dolphins had Tua, had some amazing pieces, but I think when we look back at the Shane Steichen season with the Colts, with Richardson in his first year, he got injured early, but we're only talking first 4 games. We might see a similar level of improvement relative to Saints numbers last year. Last hire, Brian Schottenheimer for the Dallas Cowboys. I don't know what to make of this because it doesn't fit in with anything that we're talking about. He's the first internal promotion from offensive coordinator to first-time head coach that will have play calling duties since Dirk Cutter in 2016. And what's interesting with this and why I don't know how to make of this is when I look down this list of other coaches that were hired and some of these offensive minds that were poached, if you will, you think about some of these resets. We talked about the McVay reset in the Rams, the Shanahan reset with San Francisco, the LaFleur reset in Green Bay, even like Stefanski and Taylor to an extent in Cincinnati, O'Connell in Minnesota taking over for a very defensive-focused unit, Daboll with the Giants, McDaniel, as we talked about, replacing Flores, Steichen in Indy, and even to an extent, Dave Canales last year in Carolina. All of these hires, and for the most part, you can look at this list of 21 and say like 18 to 19 of the 20 were guys viewed as really great offensive minds that were poached from other teams to drive a bit of a cultural and play calling and scheme reset internally. Now, none of that is really true for the Dallas Cowboys because Brian Schottenheimer in 2013 was the OC for the Cowboys. Mike McCarthy was calling plays, but Schottenheimer was the offensive coordinator for the Cowboys when they scored 30 points a game and led the league in scoring. All 31 other teams in the NFL for 2 years have looked at Brian Schottenheimer after doing that and decided not to hire him or give him the head coaching opportunity. This isn't a woe is me excuse and permission for Brian Schottenheimer, but this is saying, what did 31 teams see for 2 consecutive years that wasn't enticing enough from Schottenheimer, who was tied to the best offense in football? What did they not see to consider hiring him? And I can ask the same question about Dirk Cutter with the Buccaneers. The year before he was promoted to head coach of Tampa Bay, he had a Buccaneers offense that was top 3 in yards per play. And so both of these guys have been tied to very good offenses. Neither of them were hired by other teams. We haven't heard from Dirk Cutter in a very long time anywhere. What happens with Brian Schottenheimer, who, again, hasn't been given that opportunity? And so this isn't a cultural reset internally. It's not a scheme reset internally. And perhaps if it is, it's more running than Mike McCarthy warranted, which is kind of viewed as a negative. Typically, these coaches that are hired are bringing aggression and passing and making life easier for the quarterback. If anything, based on how the Cowboys have built their roster, aside from George Pickens, it would imply kind of the opposite is happening. And so to me, as I look at this, there's no modern coaching tree connection for Schottenheimer. He's not tied to Reed. He's not tied to Shanahan. He doesn't necessarily do anything that's viewed as modern and turning things over. And like Cutter, he was a guy that was in his 50s, and he wasn't one of these young, new, upcoming hires the teams got really excited about. So to me, as I look at this, if Brian Schottenheimer and the Cowboys have drastic improvement in the first 4 weeks, I don't think it's because anything Brian Schottenheimer is introducing or bringing new to the team. I think it's because Dak Prescott is healthy and has a really good training camp and a really good June and July and comes into the season through August back similar to the Dak of old, coming off of the bad injury that ended his year last year. I think it's because Pickens proves a viable wide receiver number 2, opposite of CeeDee Lamb. And I think it's because the Cowboys this year, unlike last year, have competent running backs on the roster. Last year, they were relying on the worst running back room in all of football to run the football a lot, and it never worked. And so I think the best comparison for any of these past 21 coaches for Schottenheimer is probably Dirk Cutter. Do I think that it ends as badly as that did? No, probably not, because the Cowboys have a much better roster than what the Buccaneers had. But it's a odd hire that's kind of the outlier of the 4 this year that doesn't really fit in with the traditional path some of these teams have taken and had a lot of success with. And so that's how I'm kind of looking at what's going on with the Dallas Cowboys. So I thought this was personally a very interesting article that was posted on footballbettors.com. It was a lot of fun to put together. There were some good takeaways to it, and I think just gives some answers and some context around the question of, does hiring an offensive head coach that is calling plays help and have immediate impact? And as we said, the answer is yes, but you're really looking for these drastic shifts and these drastic changes for all of these teams. One scheduling note that I want to bring up that I thought was interesting today, following a leak that was thrown out, was the fact that we saw the Washington Commanders allegedly tied to the Spain game against the Miami Dolphins in Madrid. And why I think this is significant is because in another edition of the Football Bettors newsletter that went out earlier this week, I talked about the Commanders' schedule specifically, and the best case scenario being that they avoid the Chiefs' treatment from 2024 as much as possible. If you remember last year, the Chiefs were scheduled to play on 6 of the 7 days of the week. They had 6 standalone games, not counting playoffs. They had 3 games in 11 days. They were the showcase team that was shopped around on all these different channels and days and avenues that the NFL leveraged to get a lot of attention in these big games to drive traffic. The rumor that is brewing behind the scenes is that Washington is going to be that showcase team this season. And there have already been 5 standalone games for the Washington Commanders tied to the schedule released next week. Thursday night football at Green Bay, Sunday night football home to Dallas and Denver, Monday night football against Chicago, and then Thursday football at Philadelphia on Christmas Day. And so the Commanders are already tied to 5 of these standalone games. If they are also now, if the leak is true this morning, being tied to the Madrid game in Spain, that would get them to arguably a worse version of what the Chiefs' schedule had last year with the international travel included, and makes this schedule and the rest spots and the rest scenarios look really tough for the Washington Commanders, who, by the way, right now, their schedule ranks and projects as the 9th most difficult schedule of any team. So nothing's going to come easy for the Commanders overall the entire season as it is. It's going to be a very tough schedule to navigate. But if they actually get the Spain-Madrid game, which may be leaked as early as Monday and made official as the NFL is now doing a bit of a tour for the schedule, if that's the case, and they draw these 5 standalone games, that 9th most difficult schedule for the Commanders number gets a lot more difficult in the coming days. So something to watch for Monday and Tuesday as the NFL starts to circle around. Starts to look really, really tough for the Washington Commanders. Want to say hello to Bryce Miller, saying hope all is well. Hope all is well with you. Appreciates the offseason work. That's awesome. I'm glad you're enjoying this. If anybody has comments after the video, drop them down in the comments. Raul Havana is saying Browns have agreed to retire Sanders' number after he makes the practice squad. There's been a lot of commentary about the retiring, unretiring numbers, guys asking retired players to use their jersey numbers. I think it's one of the silliest things that we've seen players being drafted willing to do. I mean, you think about Lawrence Taylor, one of the best defenders of all time. And you have Abdul Carter drafted 3rd, and he's going out of his way to ask. I don't know if it's like a new youth and culture thing where it's not viewed as important and it's not viewed as like a sacred number in a way, but the way some of these guys are going out of their way to ask these legends of the game to use their number, absolutely crazy. And from a player's perspective, why would you not want your own number to be retired one day? I don't know why this is shifting and why this is changing. Now, obviously, the Sanders one is a joke, but just on a side note and a tangent, it's crazy to me that that's coming up. Crunch Time is saying fantastic breakdown with these coaching changes. Glad you enjoyed it as well. Ryan Roberts with the Cowboys comment, bring in of Pickens, likely more cover 2, more opening in the run game, which is clear focused with investment of Booker and bringing in a few RBs. I think that's a good point. We're going to see Pickens as the deep threat, as he always is, the vertical downfield wide receiver. I think what he really opens up is a lot of targets and opportunity for Lamb underneath. When you look at their receiving heat maps, Pickens dominates the outside, and you see Lamb a lot more inside on those cutting routes that he's so good at running, those slants off the line. I think that's the big advantage that we're going to see. And does that tie into the run game? Absolutely. So you're right in that. Again, I go back to Schottenheimer. I don't think he brings anything wildly unique and different that's going to completely change this offense. I think the offense is just going to be better because they're going to be healthier and they have better pieces than they did last year. All right, that will do it for me today. I hope everybody has a fantastic Friday. Encourage everybody, if you're watching right now and you're leaving, raspicks.com/NFL. The service is now live for 2025, first release as early as next Thursday. Something to watch out for. Head over to the site, check it out, see all the details at raspicks.com/NFL. Have a great Friday, everybody. Have a great weekend. We'll chat with you again bright and early Monday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific time.